I remember that day like it was carved into my bones. The kitchen, once my sanctuary, now felt like a courtroom. I had spent 45 years perfecting the art of cooking, the smells, the textures, the subtle alchemy that made my family's dinners memorable. And yet, there she was, my own daughter-in-law, standing with her arms crossed, lips pressed in that smug little line that had haunted me for months. "You're too old to be in here," she sneered, tossing a wooden spoon onto the counter like it was some relic of a bygone era. "Why don't you let someone younger handle the cooking?" I felt the air thicken. My heart hammered, not from fear, but from a strange, suffocating kind of shame. I had been pushed out of the one place that had always felt like home. My kitchen. My domain. My pride. And now, at 72, I was being told that I no longer mattered, that my hands, though wrinkled and spotted, no longer had value. I didn't shout. I didn't cry, though a part of me wanted to scream so loudly that the walls themselves would tremble. I simply nodded and walked out. The clatter of the wooden spoon seemed to echo in my head long after the door had closed behind me. Days passed, and the humiliation festered. Everywhere I went, I felt her words echoing. At the grocery store, the butcher, even at church, I could sense the whispers: "She's too old. Too old to cook. Too old to matter. Too old to exist in a space she had owned her entire life." And yet, that sting, that cruel, uninvited insult, planted something strange inside me. A fire. A slow-burning, insistent fire. If she thought she could erase me, she was gravely mistaken. She had underestimated what 72 years of experience, wisdom, and stubborn pride could accomplish. It started small. I dusted off the old recipe books, the ones I hadn't opened in years, tucked away behind yellowing cloth covers and fragile wooden shelves. I traced my fingers over the familiar lines, feeling the pulse of each dish I had created over decades. And then, quietly, almost rebelliously, I began to cook. Not for anyone in that house. Not for anyone who had humiliated me. I cooked for myself. The first meal I made was simple: a roast chicken, seasoned the way my mother had taught me, golden and fragrant, tender enough to melt in the mouth. I set it on a small, wobbly table in the corner of my apartment, lit a candle, and sat down. Alone. And yet, for the first time in days, I felt alive. Word began to spread. My neighbor, Mrs. Carver, popped by, claiming she had forgotten to buy groceries. She left with a small container of roast chicken, eyes wide, whispering something about how she hadn't tasted anything so perfect in years. And then another neighbor, and another. Soon, I realized that my kitchen, though stripped from me in my own home, had found a new life. But I kept it a secret from her, the one who had laughed at my weak hands. She had no idea that her cruel words had unleashed something unstoppable. And I smiled, quietly, almost imperceptibly, as I stirred the soup the next evening, thinking, dignity doesn't ask permission. Respect isn't given. And love, even when denied, can grow anywhere, even in the shadow of humiliation. The fire in me was no longer quiet. It was smoldering. And it was only the beginning. It was late one rainy evening when the idea first came to me, quiet, almost imperceptible, like a whisper from somewhere deep inside. I sat by the window, watching the rain blur the streets outside, listening to the distant sounds of cars splashing through puddles, and my thoughts kept circling back to that moment in the kitchen. Her words, sharp, cutting, deliberate, echoed louder than the thunder outside: "You're too old." I clenched my fists. Too old? That word tasted bitter, but it also ignited something in me I hadn't felt in years. Anger, yes. Pain, certainly. But beneath it, a fierce, almost forbidden thrill. I wouldn't let her define me. I wouldn't let anyone tell me my time had passed. Not now. Not ever. So I started small. I rummaged through my old recipe cards, stained with decades of love and flour, tucked in boxes that smelled faintly of cedar and memory. My hands shook at first, not from weakness, but from anticipation, from excitement. I pulled out my grandmother's secret lasagna recipe, the one that had made family gatherings legendary. I hadn't made it in years. Tonight, I would make it for me. I preheated the oven, chopping, stirring, layering with meticulous care. Every movement felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. The smell of garlic, onions, and simmering tomato sauce filled the apartment, thick and intoxicating. I closed my eyes and breathed it in, letting it settle in my chest. I remembered who I was. I remembered the power of creating something with your hands, of giving comfort, of turning the mundane into something sacred. By the time I plated the lasagna, I was trembling, not from weakness, but from the surge of life coursing through me. I didn't invite anyone. I didn't need approval. I ate alone, slowly, savoring every bite. And somewhere between the melted cheese and the rich sauce, I felt a spark, a realization that I could create my own space, my own rules, my own respect. The next morning, I prepared a small batch of cupcakes, delicate little things with vanilla frosting and a sprinkle of cinnamon. I wrapped them in wax paper and walked down to Mrs. Carver's apartment. She answered the door with that familiar surprise on her face, and when she tasted one, her eyes widened. "Oh, dear, this is incredible," she whispered, almost reverently. I nodded, smiling faintly. "Just something I made." But as she closed the door behind her, I realized it wasn't just cupcakes. It was validation. It was the first step in reclaiming my dignity, in proving that I wasn't invisible, and that my age did not define my worth. The whispers started slowly. Neighbors began asking for small things here and there, cookies, a casserole, a pie. I kept my little operation quiet at first, careful, almost secretive, enjoying the thrill of being needed without her knowing. Each satisfied smile, each word of gratitude, fed the fire inside me. It wasn't about revenge, not exactly. It was about being seen, about being recognized, about proving that the hands she deemed too old still had the power to bring people together. And then it hit me, if people would line up for my recipes, if my food could bring joy, maybe, just maybe, this was bigger than I ever imagined. I wasn't just reclaiming the kitchen in my home, I was creating a kingdom of my own, one dish at a time. That night, I sat by my window again, watching the rain. But this time, it wasn't sadness or humiliation that filled me, it was possibility. The world outside was wet and gray, but inside me, something had caught fire. Something unstoppable. And I knew, she had no idea what I was about to become. By the time the second week rolled around, my kitchen was no longer just a refuge, it had become my battleground. Every counter, every pot, every spoon held a new purpose. I wasn't just cooking for survival or for comfort anymore, I was cooking to reclaim a part of myself that had been stripped away, and the fire in me grew stronger with every dish. I started keeping a small ledger, almost instinctively. Names, requests, what people liked and didn't like. Mrs. Carver was my first loyal customer, followed by Mr. Patel down the hall, and then a few more from the building. They came cautiously at first, whispering as if sharing a secret they weren't supposed to, their eyes wide with curiosity and awe. But as the flavors reached them, the whispers turned to small celebrations. And I watched it all, quiet, almost hidden, a ghost in my own life finally finding presence again. It was a quiet Wednesday when I realized I could go bigger. I had learned in my years how to scale a recipe without losing the soul of it. I made double batches of my chicken pot pie, tucking each one carefully into little foil containers. I left them outside Mrs. Carver's door with a note that simply said, "For you, with love." She called immediately, practically breathless. This is incredible, Mary." "Oh, I mean, Granny," she stammered, laughing nervously. "How do you do it?" "I don't even know how to say thank you." I laughed softly, a sound I hadn't heard myself make in months. "Just enjoy it," I said, and hung up. The thrill of her joy, of people noticing, was intoxicating. It was as if each compliment, each satisfied sigh, was slowly building a wall around the humiliation she had thrown at me. And yet, I was careful. Every step was calculated, cautious. My daughter-in-law still walked through my life like a shadow, oblivious to what was growing quietly beneath her nose. She had no idea that her cruel words had sparked a quiet rebellion that would soon extend far beyond her petty judgments. It wasn't long before requests started coming in from beyond my immediate neighbors. One evening, as I was closing the apartment door behind me, a young mother I had only spoken to in passing stopped me. "I heard about your lasagna," she said, eyes gleaming. "Could I buy some for my family?" My heart thumped wildly. Could I? Could I actually turn this small spark into something real? Something powerful? I nodded, voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Yes. I can do that." That night, as I prepared the orders, I felt a strange, almost dizzying sense of power. For years, I had been dismissed, overlooked, humiliated. But now, for the first time in a long time, I was in control. People depended on me. People wanted me. And it felt delicious. I worked late into the night, chopping, stirring, baking, tasting. Every aroma that filled my apartment was a reminder I was not invisible. I was not too old. I was alive, and I was making my mark. And all the while, the thought of her, the one who had called me too old, smoldered quietly in the back of my mind. One day, she would see what she had underestimated. One day, she would witness the dignity she tried to strip from me come alive in a way she could never ignore. And as I placed the last tray into the oven, I allowed myself a small, private smile. The road ahead was long, and the fire that had been sparked by humiliation was only just beginning to roar. I could almost hear the whispers already. Soon, they wouldn't be whispers. Soon, the neighborhood would come alive with my name, my recipes, my presence. And it started quietly, like a ripple in a still pond, and then it grew. At first, it was just Mrs. Carver, Mr. Patel, and a handful of neighbors whispering about my lasagna or my pot pies. But soon, the ripple became impossible to ignore. My little apartment kitchen, once a private refuge from humiliation, was turning into something bigger than I had dared to imagine. One Saturday morning, I was arranging freshly baked rolls on a tray when there was a soft knock at my door. I opened it to find Mrs. Hernandez from 3 floors up, holding a shopping bag and looking slightly embarrassed. I heard about your pies," she said cautiously. "Could I try one? My family's having company tonight." I nodded, quietly, hiding the thrill that surged through me. "Of course." She left, and I thought nothing of it, until 2 more neighbors appeared by mid-afternoon, asking for a few cookies here, a small casserole there. By evening, a small line had formed outside my door, a mix of curiosity and quiet admiration in their eyes. People I had barely spoken to in years were now seeking me out, hungry not just for food, but for what I had to offer, the warmth, the love, the decades of care and craft embedded in every dish. And then came the moment that made it all feel real. Mrs. Carver returned, eyes wide. "Granny, the whole block is talking about you. Your food, it's like magic." I swallowed hard, feeling the strange swell of pride and vindication. For the first time in months, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen. I felt powerful. And underneath it all, a simmering satisfaction lingered, because the woman who had laughed at me, who had called me too old to cook, had no idea this was happening. I kept records now, carefully, almost obsessively. Orders, requests, preferences. My kitchen was no longer just a refuge, it was a command center, a place where I controlled the narrative of my life. Every dish that left my hands carried a little piece of my dignity, a whisper of revenge disguised as kindness. It wasn't about cruelty. It wasn't about proving her wrong for the sake of it. It was about reclaiming my life. About showing myself, and the world, that age doesn't diminish worth. That experience, care, and love are timeless. Weeks passed, and the small line outside my door became a daily fixture. People began calling ahead, asking me to prepare meals for birthdays, gatherings, even small parties. I found myself rising before dawn, carefully planning menus, testing flavors, experimenting with old family recipes I had never shared before. The apartment smelled of rosemary, garlic, cinnamon, and roasted chicken from morning until night, and every scent carried a quiet victory. One evening, as I closed the door after a particularly busy day, I noticed the reflection in the window across the hall, my daughter-in-law. She was staring up at my apartment, as if sensing something she couldn't name. Her brow furrowed, lips tight, eyes narrowing. I didn't speak to her. I didn't need to. She would discover soon enough. And when she did, I knew there would be no words to undo the truth, that I, the woman she had dismissed, humiliated, and laughed at, had built something she couldn't touch. My age, my hands, my failing skills, all of it had become a source of power, of love, of undeniable respect. That night, as I sat at my little kitchen table, counting orders and planning the week ahead, I allowed myself a quiet smile. The fire that had been lit by humiliation was now blazing, unstoppable. People were talking, lining up, spreading the word. And somewhere, in the shadows, the woman who had tried to diminish me was beginning to realize that she had underestimated the very thing she had tried to erase. I poured myself a cup of tea, and as the steam curled into the night air, I whispered to myself, almost reverently, "This is only the beginning." By now, I had lost count of the orders. My tiny apartment, once quiet and shadowed, buzzed with a life I hadn't dared imagine. Neighbors knocked, friends called, even strangers from down the street came seeking my cooking. Every dish carried more than flavor, it carried my years, my experience, my heart. And in each bite, people could taste it. They could feel it. It was a Tuesday afternoon when it happened, my first big order. Mrs. Patel, who ran the local bakery supply shop, stopped by with a note of urgency. Her son was hosting a neighborhood dinner, and she insisted, practically pleading, that I prepare a full meal for 15 people. 15. My hands shook with anticipation as I agreed. This was no longer a quiet rebellion, it was a statement. I spent the entire day cooking, tasting, stirring, and seasoning with precision. My back ached, my hands were raw from constant chopping, yet every ache was a reminder that I was alive, that I mattered. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across my kitchen, but I didn't notice. I was too immersed in the alchemy of flavors, the meticulous layering of textures, the way a dish could hold a story in every bite. By the time the food was delivered, the neighborhood was abuzz. People whispered, laughed, and marveled at the mystery chef who had suddenly appeared, whose dishes seemed to make every meal extraordinary. I watched from my doorway, unseen, as plates were passed, smiles grew wide, and compliments rained down. And then I saw her. My daughter-in-law. Standing at the edge of the gathering, awkward, stiff, her eyes narrowing as she tried to process the scene. I couldn't help but smile, faint and private. She had always believed she could diminish me, but here I was, glowing not from arrogance, but from the recognition and love of a community I had quietly nurtured with my hands and heart. The whispers about me grew louder with each passing day. People began to call in advance, asking for my dishes, requesting my recipes, even offering to pay in advance. My small side business had transformed into something bigger, something undeniable. I found myself sketching menus, organizing schedules, even hiring a young woman from the neighborhood to help with deliveries. The thrill of being needed, wanted, respected, it was intoxicating. At night, when I finally sat down with a cup of tea, the apartment smelled like rosemary and success. I thought about the day she had humiliated me, the words that had cut so deep. I had carried them for weeks, a heavy, bitter weight. And now they were gone, replaced with pride, confidence, and the quiet joy of knowing I had reclaimed what was mine. But the most satisfying part, I realized, wasn't the orders, the praise, or even the growing business. It was the truth that I had lived. That despite being pushed aside, ignored, and laughed at, I had risen quietly, deliberately, and with grace. My dignity wasn't given, it had been forged in the shadows of humiliation, strengthened by every plate I served, every smile I earned, every life I touched. And she would never forget. A week later, at a small community gathering, someone whispered loudly enough for her to hear, "Isn't it amazing? Granny's cooking is better than any restaurant in town." I saw her jaw tighten. I saw the flicker of disbelief in her eyes. And I let myself smile again, not triumphantly, not cruelly, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been underestimated and had quietly, beautifully, proven their worth. Humiliation had sparked something unstoppable in me. And as I prepared for another round of orders that evening, I whispered to myself, this fire isn't just burning, it's consuming the doubt, the mockery, the shame. And it's only getting stronger. It was one of those mornings when the sunlight hit the streets in gold, and yet I barely noticed it. My world had shrunk and grown at the same time. My kitchen, cramped and humble, was now a hub of activity, filled with the smells of roasting, baking, and simmering that drew the entire neighborhood like a magnet. People had started lining up outside my door even before I opened it. Early birds, I thought, but in truth, they weren't just hungry, they were eager. The orders had become so numerous that I had to set up a small system, labels, timers, containers, even pre-orders for the next day. My hands were weary, my back ached, and my knees reminded me that I was no longer young. But with every dish I prepared, with every satisfied smile from someone taking that first bite, I felt invincible. And then she appeared. My daughter-in-law. The woman who had once laughed at me, belittled me, and shoved me out of the kitchen like I was some relic of the past. She stood at the end of the line, awkwardly clutching her purse, her eyes darting from me to the crowd, and back again. I could see the confusion and disbelief etched across her face. "Granny," she started, her voice faltering. I didn't realize. I didn't answer. I didn't need to." Her words stumbled and fell into silence, drowned out by the soft laughter and chatter of the people I had quietly won over. I simply carried my trays, offering dishes to my customers, smiling warmly at each person. The truth was visible in every bite they took, in every expression of joy and satisfaction. I had become more than just a cook, I had become a presence, a force, a name that carried respect. She watched, and I let her. Every time someone complimented my food, every time someone asked for seconds, every time a neighbor thanked me personally, I could see the realization settling into her mind. She had underestimated me. She had thought age meant weakness, that experience could be dismissed, that love and care could be replaced with arrogance. But here I was, standing tall, every plate a testament to decades of skill and dedication she had mocked. The line continued to grow. People from down the street, even a few I barely knew, had come seeking my food. Word had spread like wildfire. My small side business had become a sensation. And yet, I remained quiet, humble, almost invisible in my own triumph. This was not about showing her up, it was about reclaiming my dignity, proving my worth, and, quietly, making her understand that she could not erase me. At one point, she opened her mouth again, perhaps to offer an excuse or a justification, but the words never formed. She realized she had no place here. She had no power. She had been a spectator to a transformation she had tried to prevent. I met her gaze briefly and simply smiled, softly, without malice but with undeniable certainty. She had seen too much. She understood too late. That night, after the last order was picked up and my kitchen finally fell silent, I sank into my chair, exhausted but alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. The humiliation I had carried for so long had been replaced with something stronger, respect, love, and dignity. Not just from strangers or neighbors, but from myself. And somewhere in the shadows of that evening, I imagined her, speechless and reflective, realizing that the fire she had once tried to snuff out was now blazing brighter than ever. I poured myself a cup of tea and allowed the quiet satisfaction to settle in. My kitchen, my hands, my age, they were no longer limitations. They were proof that strength, love, and resilience could flourish even where doubt and cruelty had tried to plant despair. Humiliation had become triumph. And I, quietly, had become unstoppable. The following weeks were a blur, a whirlwind of smells, laughter, and the soft clatter of plates. My little apartment had transformed into something I could never have imagined. The hum of activity, once overwhelming, now felt like music, a rhythm that matched the pulse of my determination. Every order, every knock on the door, was a reminder that I had reclaimed something far bigger than a kitchen, I had reclaimed my life. People were talking. Everywhere. My name was whispered in doorways, echoed in hallways, and carried on the wind. They spoke of my pies, my roasts, my cakes. They spoke of the love and care baked into every dish. And through it all, I remained quietly in control, letting the reputation grow like a secret garden no one could trample. One afternoon, while kneading dough for my famous cinnamon rolls, I looked out the window and saw a small line forming outside my building. They were early this time, neighbors, strangers, even a few curious children tugging at their parents' hands. I smiled quietly. They didn't know it yet, but they weren't just waiting for food, they were waiting to witness something rare, a woman who refused to be diminished, who had turned humiliation into power, who had transformed a quiet life into something unforgettable. And then, of course, there was her. My daughter-in-law. She had been watching from a distance, trying to mask her envy and disbelief behind a mask of indifference, but I could see it in the way she furrowed her brow, the tight line of her lips, the slight trembling of her hands. She had believed she could erase me, but here I was, alive, respected, unstoppable. Orders continued to pile up. I started keeping detailed notes, learning people's preferences, experimenting with flavors and presentation. Each plate was a statement: skill cannot be diminished by age, experience cannot be laughed away. Every satisfied customer was a small victory, a quiet whisper to the woman who had tried to shame me: I am more than you ever imagined. Word spread beyond the building, beyond the block. Soon, calls came from families I didn't even know, asking for my dishes for birthdays, anniversaries, gatherings. I started planning ahead, creating menus, organizing my tiny space for maximum efficiency. My kitchen was no longer just a room, it was a command center, a place where I wielded influence quietly but undeniably. And yet, through it all, I remained calm. I didn't gloat. I didn't flaunt my success. I simply worked, day after day, pouring my heart into everything I created. The fire that had been sparked by humiliation had become a steady, roaring flame. I had discovered something I hadn't realized I was missing: respect, yes, but also self-worth, independence, and a quiet, unshakable power that no one could take from me. Late one night, as I wiped down the counters and cleaned the last of the pots, I allowed myself a private thought, a whisper into the quiet: they all see it now. The hands they thought too old are the hands that built this. The mind they thought slow is the mind that planned it. And the heart they thought irrelevant is the heart that brought them all together. I poured myself a cup of tea, sitting by the window as the streetlights flickered on. In the shadows, I imagined her again, trying to comprehend what she could not erase. My daughter-in-law, speechless, forced to recognize the truth she had once scoffed at. Humiliation had been the spark. Resilience had been the fuel. And now, I had become something more than a cook. I had become a presence, a force, a quiet legend in my own neighborhood. And the fire inside me was only growing. By now, my kitchen was no longer just my sanctuary, it had become a destination. People came from blocks away, sometimes even strangers I had never met, all drawn by the quiet legend of the woman who had been too old to cook. They lined up outside my apartment door, chatting excitedly, sharing stories of the flavors and aromas they had experienced. I could feel their anticipation, their hunger not just for food, but for something authentic, something crafted with care and decades of experience. Orders had multiplied exponentially. My neighbors' polite requests had become formal inquiries, some with checks, some with careful promises to pay later. I had turned my small side kitchen into a meticulous operation: lists, schedules, and notes stacked neatly by the counter, each one a testament to the growth that had begun quietly, months ago, from humiliation and quiet resolve. And then there was her. My daughter-in-law. She had tried, I think, to ignore what was happening, to pretend it didn't concern her, but she couldn't. She hovered nearby at gatherings, her arms crossed, her jaw tight, trying to mask a growing disbelief. She had wanted to make me invisible, to push me out, to define me as too old and irrelevant. Yet here I was, commanding attention, respect, and even admiration, without uttering a single word about her. I remember the day she finally spoke, her voice low and uncertain. "I didn't know. People actually liked your food," she stammered, as if the words themselves were foreign. I simply smiled and nodded, carrying a tray of steaming lasagna to the waiting neighbors. Words weren't necessary. The proof was in the lines of people, the laughter, the gratitude, the way they devoured every dish as if they had been waiting for it their whole lives. I had become careful, even strategic. I experimented with new recipes, revived forgotten family classics, and added little touches that made people pause, savor, and remember. Each plate that left my hands carried not just food, but pride, history, and an unspoken message: you cannot dismiss someone whose heart and mind refuse to grow old. The fire inside me burned hotter than ever. It wasn't just about the food anymore, it was about presence, about the quiet assertion of value, about dignity earned through action rather than demanded. Every compliment, every repeat order, every whispered recommendation fed that flame. I had turned my humiliation into triumph, my exclusion into inclusion, and my silence into a roar that no one could ignore. I could see it in her eyes now, the woman who had tried to erase me. Confusion. Shock. Maybe even envy. She had imagined that her mockery had the power to define me, to diminish me, to strip me of relevance. But it hadn't. It had done the opposite. It had sparked something unstoppable. One evening, as I closed the door behind the last customer, I paused, leaning against the counter, exhausted but elated. The apartment smelled like rosemary and roasting chicken, like baked bread and cinnamon rolls, like victory. I poured myself a cup of tea, savoring the quiet moment, the stillness, the satisfaction. And I whispered to myself, almost reverently, they all see it now. The hands they thought too old, the heart they thought too weak, the mind they thought too slow, they all belong to me. And I have built something they cannot take away. Humiliation had been the spark. Persistence had been the fuel. And now, I had reached the peak of something far greater than cooking. I had found respect, admiration, and a quiet, unshakable power that not even cruelty could touch. I sipped my tea, letting the warmth fill me, and allowed a private, triumphant smile. The fire was still burning. And it would burn brighter with every dish I created, every life I touched, and every quiet moment of victory. By this point, my kitchen had become something I could hardly have imagined months ago. The aroma of roasting chicken, baked bread, and simmering sauces greeted me every morning like an old friend. The hum of activity, the knocks at my door, the small packages carefully prepared and sent out, it all reminded me that I had built something far bigger than myself. Something that no one could take away. Neighbors, strangers, even local shopkeepers now came to me, not just for food, but for advice, for a kind word, for a moment of connection. They didn't see an old woman, they saw experience, skill, and a quiet authority that could only come from years of dedication. I watched them laugh, chatter, and savor every bite, and I felt a pride so profound it almost brought tears to my eyes. And still, she watched. My daughter-in-law lingered on the edges of gatherings, her envy thinly veiled by awkward politeness. I could see it, the realization slowly settling in that her attempts to diminish me had failed utterly. She had tried to erase me, to make me invisible, to define me as too old and irrelevant. And now, every smile directed at me, every word of praise, every order placed was a quiet rebuke. I remember one evening in particular. The line outside my door stretched down the street, neighbors chatting excitedly as they waited. I carried tray after tray of golden pies and savory casseroles, smiling quietly at each person. One woman, tears in her eyes, whispered, "You've reminded us all what real love and care taste like. Your cooking, it's like a warm hug." I felt a lump in my throat. Those words weren't just about food, they were about validation, about acknowledgement, about dignity restored. I had taken humiliation, carried it quietly, and transformed it into something beautiful and undeniable. And then I saw her. She had finally stepped closer, trying to appear casual, but her face betrayed her, shock, disbelief, and perhaps even a flicker of fear. She had thought she could belittle me, push me aside, define me by age and weakness. But now, in front of everyone, the truth was clear. I was respected. I was loved. I was unstoppable. She opened her mouth, likely to offer a comment or excuse, but the words never came. I met her gaze briefly, letting the silence speak louder than anything I could have said. She had underestimated me. She had mocked me. And now, she was powerless. That night, after the last order had been delivered and my apartment finally fell silent, I sat at my kitchen table, reflecting. I realized that I hadn't just built a catering business. I had built a legacy, one that could not be diminished by cruelty or disdain. I had proven to myself, and to the world, that age is not weakness, that experience is invaluable, and that love and care can transform even the deepest humiliation into triumph. As I sipped my tea and looked out at the quiet street, I felt something profound. This wasn't just about food, or business, or even respect. It was about reclaiming power, finding one's voice, and turning adversity into a force that no one could ignore. I allowed myself a private smile. The fire that had been sparked by cruelty, by dismissal, by words meant to wound me, it was now a blazing flame. And it would continue to grow, not for revenge, but for proof that dignity, love, and resilience can flourish in the face of anything. And somewhere in the quiet shadows, I imagined her, my daughter-in-law, standing speechless, confronted by the very truth she had tried to bury. She had underestimated me. And now, everyone knew my worth. It was the morning of the neighborhood festival when I truly realized how far I had come. My small catering operation, born out of humiliation and quiet rebellion, had grown into something that touched lives, connected people, and demanded respect. The streets outside my apartment were alive with chatter, laughter, and the scent of my cooking drifting through the air like a banner declaring my victory. People lined up hours before I opened my door, eager for a taste of my pies, my roasts, my cakes. Some came from blocks away, others from streets I had never walked, all drawn by whispers of a woman whose hands had been called too old but whose skills had become legendary. I moved among them quietly, distributing dishes, taking orders, and offering a warm smile to each person. Each compliment, each satisfied bite, felt like a quiet celebration of my resilience, a testament to the power of persistence and pride. And there she was. My daughter-in-law, standing near the edge of the crowd, arms folded, lips tight, eyes wide. She had tried to erase me, belittle me, push me aside. But today, she was nothing more than a spectator to the life I had built from the ashes of humiliation. She could no longer ignore what she had dismissed. I saw disbelief in her eyes, and perhaps, for the first time, a flicker of respect, or at least the painful acknowledgement that she had underestimated me. I didn't seek her attention, didn't gloat or speak a word to remind her of her cruelty. I simply moved through the crowd, delivering food, listening to laughter, seeing the joy on faces that had never known my cooking before this chapter of my life. My power wasn't in confrontation, it was in presence. It was in the quiet strength of knowing my worth, my skill, my heart, and letting that speak louder than words ever could. One neighbor, a young mother with 2 children in tow, whispered as she walked past, "Granny, your food, it's magical. You've changed our lives." And it was true. I had changed lives, not by force, not by anger, but by showing what care, dedication, and love could accomplish when nurtured patiently, fiercely, and without compromise. As the day went on, I watched families gather, friends smile, strangers meet and connect, all drawn together by something as simple and profound as a meal made with care. I realized, in that moment, that my kitchen had become more than a space, it had become a beacon, a testament to resilience, skill, and heart. I had taken humiliation and transformed it into dignity, love, and respect. And then, quietly, I looked back at her. My daughter-in-law, speechless, unable to deny the reality that I had created. She had tried to define me, diminish me, write me off. But I had rewritten the story. Not through vengeance, not through malice, but through the undeniable truth of my presence, my skill, and my heart. I took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of accomplishment, the quiet thrill of victory that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with me. I had been pushed aside, laughed at, made to feel invisible. And yet here I stood, celebrated, respected, and quietly triumphant. The humiliation that had once burned so sharply had transformed into something far more powerful, undeniable dignity. That night, as I closed the door to my kitchen and poured myself a cup of tea, I whispered softly to myself, I am more than they ever imagined. I am seen. I am respected. I am unstoppable. Humiliation had sparked the fire. Love, care, and resilience had fanned it into a blaze. And now, nothing, not age, not cruelty, not doubt, could ever extinguish it. So if you ever find yourself pushed aside, mocked, or told you're too old, too weak, or not needed anymore, remember this story. Remember that dignity can rise from the deepest humiliation. Respect can grow from silence. And the fire they try to extinguish in you can become the blaze that lights your entire path. I didn't win by yelling. I didn't win by fighting. I won by becoming undeniable. Because sometimes, the sweetest revenge isn't anger, it's success. It's peace. It's knowing you built something no one can take away. And if you're listening to this, let this be your reminder, never let anyone throw you out of your own kitchen. Build your own, and make the whole world line up at your door.